We continue with the fourth Congress, Building Peace with Gender Perspective. We start with panel 3, which is the paradigm of peace building, with the seminar for the investigation for peace and at the University Primera de España. And we're very thankful for this work and this activity. We have Dr. Varela, who has a degree in history, specialized in history of the Americas, with a master's in social sciences, doctor in political sciences, and she has a degree at the University in Madrid. She's an academic and investigator in the university in Mexico with different publications, international fora, developed her investigation around the processes of political change, the way that democracy works, and among the recent publications we have coordination along with Juan Luis Hernández Avendaño, Los Indignados Mexicanos, and the influence with the PRI and presidents in 2017, a book, Ignacio Yacuriel, Las Fronteras in 2019, papers, Universities in Front of Gender Violence, published recently in 2020, and the Universities and Gender Perspective in the University of Guanajuato in 2020. Thank you, Elvia. A pleasure to be here. The second day of the fourth Congress in Peace Building with the Gender Perspective. It's an honor to be invited to moderate this section, this discussion, because we couldn't talk about this if we didn't take care of all the balance, all the problems, family life, work life, all the problems that we face as women in our current societies, and that has to do and is everything linked to the non-existence of peace. The violence phenomena. This is just a panel that is so rich. We have 3 researchers of the highest level. I'm not going to take too much time in my introduction because what I want to do is to give them the floor as soon as possible. I just want to remind you and thank you for being here. You can send your questions or comments through YouTube. That would be sent to me, and after the presentations of our 3 speakers, we're going to be able to ask those questions to them. Here we have Dr. Carmen Magallón Portoles, Dr. Irene Comins-Mignol, and Dr. Mercedes Alcañiz Mascardo. First, I'm going to give the floor to Carmen Magallón, who I'm going to read about her CV. We are going to have between 20 and 30 minutes in order to have time for questions and comments, for dialogue that is always so rich if we want to talk about peace building. Dr. Carmen Magallón Portoles, she is chairman of the Research for Peace Seminar Foundation in Zaragoza, January 2019, where she had already taken other posts. She's also honorary chair of the League of Women for Peace and Freedom. She is a PhD in Sciences and Politics, and she has a certificate program in philosophy. She has been researching in the history of women in science, analysis of scientific activities, and building peace. She has taught classes, presentations in different countries in Latin America. Among her books, we have a book published in 2006 and Pioneers in Spain and Sciences published in 2004. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. You have the floor. Thank you, Dr. Elena Manena. I want to thank Dr. Elia González del Pliego. It's a pleasure to share this with friends and colleagues. I want to talk about 4 different things. First, we're going to be having a reflection on this times in pandemic, then the investigation, then criticisms on science, and conclusions. In many cases, I'm not going to be able to go deep because we don't have much time. Talking about the times of pandemic that we're going through, this has brought along something that we had seen. Women have been, we know that it's to take on the human vulnerability. This all depends on taking care to survive in the beginning of times, as long, along the life. We can see this. And with this, we have all the vulnerabilities that are built, and sometimes they're the only vulnerabilities. Sometimes women, children, the poor, these are linked to the lack of equality that is added to vulnerability. From feminism, in decades, we have seen the work of care in the hands of women, a work that is invisible and is not acknowledged properly, which responds to the vulnerability, is in charge of all of this. I recall my first reading about care, a book of Ingrid Bockroot, made Women for Peace. Today, the pandemic has brought new dimensions of care. The importance of assuming this socially, that there are budgets destined to the health systems that are public, the acknowledgement, the invisible work of the health personnel, and also the visible work of the health personnel. And we are going through dramatic times. They're having a really difficult time. We are close to collapsing in the health system. These times have brought in pandemics, during the pandemic, a conflict. A lot of people do not understand why science cannot come to an agreement when we see the possible solutions as well as in the compilation of data. And this is a reflection of what we see as science, as a religion. Going to item number 2, the investigation of Carol Gilligan. We're going to see how the investigations of this psychologist help us to understand the rise of the ethics of care and the benefits of being criticizing science. She has planted the seed of what turned into theory in psychology and ethics, in economics, in social policies. She used to work, a collaborator at Colbert, at the University of Colbert. The psychologist had set a scale to measure the development of the theories in children in 2 phases, and observed that by using the scale on girls, they were getting ratings that were lower than the boys. And with this, they thought that girls, compared to boys of their same age, were less mature. Well, Gilligan, at a time where criticism of science started from the feminist perspective, she realizes that Colbert's theory is biased because it was taken in a sample of 84 boys that he and his collaborators followed for 20 years. So she questions Colbert's results because they were androcentric in this sample. These conclusions from a sample of only boys could not be used universally to measure the development of boys and girls. It was not only a bias or deviation of Colbert, it was science, the way they were doing science. Colbert uses Freud that had written, and I quote, women show less sense of justice than men more often. They are influenced in their judgment by feelings of affection or hostility. I close the quote. Also, Piaget's observations about the play of boys and girls were showing that girls were more tolerant with respect to the rules and more willing to make exceptions in order to keep relationships going. And for Piaget, the rules, the law, was considered essential for the development of moral. He stated that it's less developed in girls than in boys. Whether for Piaget, girls are a deviation, in the case of Colbert, it's non-existent. Colbert's theory explains clearly the logic of the development of boys but not girls. In the 70s, a little bit before, the critical lines feminists started to develop in science, and it started with alternative interpretations to the observations. Nancy Shodorov was giving an interpretation in a positive sense of the statements of Freud that were linked to the feelings and by being cared by female figures, they're more prepared to empathy because this is done without having to break the affection with the figure that has care for that, and they're more prepared for the needs and the feelings of others as if they were their own. That's why from the Education for Peace, we can say that uh, men and women have to care both, they both have to care for the children. Carl Ninevan will use a sample that is non-biased using boys and girls, and it doesn't pretend to interpret to show an example of differences, but to do something on something that she would call a different voice. States a boy and a girl, 11 years old, the dilemma of a man known as Hayes, and states what should be done by Haynes, whether he should steal a medication that his wife needs to survive because he can't pay for it. Gilligan sees that the boy looks into reasons that are adjusted to the rights that any judge would say that the right to life is more important than the right of property. So if he had to steal the medicine, while the girl goes around it, talks about Haynes and the pharmacist have to speak, they have to find another way to do it, that stealing the medicine could take Haynes to jail, and then the wife is going to be alone. So she sees a world that becomes coherent through human connections, not rules. This essay and the conclusions was published over 40 years ago in a Harvard journal in a text that was called With One Different Voice, Confessions of Women About the Morals. This turned into a book that was published in 1988 initially, and that here, at least my generation, read it with the Mexican edition at the Fondo de Cultura Económica group. This book gathers the research of the proposal of ethics of care. Basically, and it stated the emergence of a different voice to decide on moral dilemmas, a voice of men and women, without Gilligan associating it to an essence, but socialization that was different, how to build a feminine identity link to a caregiver, the mother, a voice capable to bring it universally, and that made sense. A few years later, Gilligan writes a text, the place of a woman in the cycle of the life of men, and he places his theory in the context of the feminist criticism of science and says, at a time when the efforts, at that time, 70s, 80s, efforts are made to restart discrimination among sexes, we realize how used we are to see life through the eyes of men. With this, I can go to the next item, criticism in feminism and science, need and fruitful character. Virginia Woolf wrote, "It might seem that science has no gender." This was a basic book back then. It might seem that the science has no gender. No, it's a man, it's a father, and it's infected. So it comes from the middle of the 20th century. This criticism was the way that she spoke about the values and bias. Some groups, social groups, were mistreated by science, by the scientific tradition, women, indigenous peoples from other cultures, nature, that seem as a storage of resources to be dominated. The story of science is filled with theory, scientific, that devaluate the experience of women, and they speak about feminine in a devaluated manner to attribute less intelligence to women, theories that they might consider often that they developed, the studies that might be harmful because it could damage the capacity for reproduction. And maybe, for example, even in the case of theories of science, the evaluation of the role of cytoplasm, that it's considered nutrition in the cell, that is a feminine role, when we have seen that the role of cytoplasm is so important. There are a number of examples. For many years, there was a devaluation of the chemistry of women that was closer to everyday life in favor of an industrial chemistry. What's interesting is that to criticize all of this, specialists in science, they don't start from scratch. They start from the support of philosophers that have criticized science. I cannot go in detail in this, although I'm fascinated in the philosophy of science. A few years ago at the University of Zaragoza, we could see the analytical synthetical distinction that says that there's no observation without the burden of the theory. This is one of the the conclusions of Hansom in his book in 58. All observation is loaded with theory. So philosophers have reached and said, when Galileo has looked at the wise man through this tube, and then the wise man do not believe what they see in the sky with this little tube that is a telescope, and they, they were right, because here we have a theory of refraction, and this observation is loaded, and there's so many examples that we could look into. Also, that the data, the theory are underdetermined by the data. So altogether, with a set of data, there are different explanations, as we have seen in the case of Charonov and many others that we could look into. For example, with different philosophers that may look at the philosophy of science in PUM, in an optional paradigm, how the paradigms allow for the observation and to see in the world things that a prior paradigm or different would not allow us to see. And we can talk about our own experience, to talk about the pioneers of science, and they studied in physics and chemistry at the beginning of the 20th century in Spain. I've had a training that was completely different, very positive in the School of Science. If I was not, just embedded in the feminist philosophy, I would not be able to see this because I could not provide importance to this. I've been asked when I visited someone and she was 90, how have you seen all of this? What I have seen and I have done and nobody else has seen. I have seen it under different light from a different paradigm. Since I am running out of time, I would like to give you two slides. Can you see my slides? Yes. Yes, Carmen, you go ahead. I'm just going to show you two slides to talk to you about some bias in gender in science. My title is from Women in Science and Science in Feminism, which is one of the statements of Harvey, one of the philosophers that we study often. Why don't we have many women philosophers? What happens? And she says, well, we have to take the leap and ask for women in science in order to question science from feminism. There footprints of gender in science, yeah, androcentrism, to look at the scientific atoms from the eyes of men, sexism. These are clear interpretations that are devaluating ideology bias and the problems that are solved with respect to the identity or who is the subject of knowledge, the debate on objectivity, conceptualization, and generalizations that are symbolic, and also bias in the methodology, hypotheses that are put together around problems. We can contrast the validity of hypotheses, choosing the sample as we have seen in Colbert, choosing the data, explanations, and so on. We have to say that the bias of the sample is present in many other samples that are taken in males because the samples in the women are more complicated because they have the rules, they change with the cycle, they're more complicated, so they decide that even with animal samples they test only in men, and then they go further with the other conclusions. I'm going to get close to finishing. I leave you to study and to develop this throughout time. And these critical tools are the ones that allowed to see Gilligan in a theory of moral development, which would be the emergence of another voice. We have to think philosophers like Evelyn Forgetter, Sandra Harding, Donna Hardwin. We have the need of being criticized in order to complete the world of knowledge that was approached basically from the perspective of white Western men of middle class. it's enough to say the following. We must, when we research, when we investigate, we need to have the basis, the epistemologies, and feminism that I cannot go into that are necessary, then take us to more knowledge, as we have seen in the case of Gilligan. It's not about taking everything down, even if they're biased. My conclusions, all of the steps, in science, there's nothing mathematical in the, things are there to be uncovered. The values are there, value in the theories historically, in the physical theories as such. We have to see the debates. Light was just a particle in the power to one side or the other. Conflicts in science, they're normal, like in society. The problem is not there's conflict, but we need to solve the coincidences from debate and from looking at the values that are implied. Science moves forward because we're on the shoulders of giants, all the past, everything that we have learned. And we have to say gigantic women as well. It's not just about inclusive language, but in the case of gigantic women, this has a meaning of how women have improved science by getting rid of the bias, including perspectives that are good for better science. The criticism of feminism, we would look at the economists, feminists have talked about looking at value to try to design, to use a different economy, trying to be careful about the center of social politics. And just to note that the ethics of care does not exclude the ethics of justice. We need the ethics of justice so we don't have impunity in front of violence. To take care of this does not mean that we're just getting rid of the value of justice. Thank you.
Así aplaudimos. Muchísimas gracias, Carmen Magallón
Thank you
Portoles.
so much, Carmen Magallón Portoles, with the introduction and setting the basis of the paradigm of care from an idea that I believe that is fundamental, which is to understand science is not a religion, is not the mirror of nature. Let's not think that this is neutral. There's nothing bigger than to hear this. And here we can identify the bias that we have seen throughout history. This is basic as we face everything that has to do with the ethics of care. And I think with this that we open the door to go into specific topics and more of care. I would like to talk about to Dr. Irene, who is a researcher in social development and peace at the University Jaume I Castellón in Spain, when she's also a professor in philosophy in the same university, and she has been a director of the Institute of Social Development from 2015 to 2019 in the University Master International Studies for Peace, Conflicts and Development, also the same university. Jaume I from 2009 to 2015. She's investigator of the University Jaume I and the Institute of Social Development and Peace. She has developed investigation at Bradford University in the United Kingdom, and she has been part of international congress. She investigates and publishes on philosophy for peace, anthropology in philosophy, gender studies, education for peace, and epistemologies for peace. Welcome, Irene. You have the floor. Thank you, Dr. Elena Varela. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organizers this fourth Congress of Peace Construction with Gender Perspective, Dr. Elvia Gonzalez, for inviting me to participate. It's also for me great to be able to share this panel with two women, Dr. Mercedes Alcaniz and Carmen Magallon, who I admire and I care for. I will start with a brief intervention and we will see. We will see the contributions for peace building, and I will close with a proposal in the value of caring as the way to do things for women. And here we can start with the reflections about how we want to work. Okay, hopefully I'm going to be able to share my screen. Our model for development in the society for consumption and the logics of competitiveness show the relationships of care between people and nature. What Leonardo Boff stated, the dictatorship of the way of being. The different facets of human life I lived according to different criteria of efficacy and efficiency, and the spaces and the times are organized around the interests of neoliberalism or in growth. This way of being and working are taking us to be part of environmental damage on Earth. The logics of the way of being at work has taken so many things in nature and instrumentation of human relations. What can we do in the way of being work that doesn't only damage the environment but brings social injustice at the same time that it brings unhappiness personally? Before this, Leonardo Wolf tries to rescue and rebuild the way of being with care. As an antidote against indifference, as an antidote as the devastation of the frail balance of biosphere and our frail unbalance as human beings. This is the way of being in the world that is rescued by our most essential humanity. We need to rebuild the value and the practice of care. From what point we can rebuild an important source is the legacy of experience for women. Historically, the role of caregivers and majority in the public space. In the investigation for peace, we have seen for years the legacy of women as caregivers because of the implication for all of this. In the investigation for peace with gender perspective, we can see, as Carmen Magallon clearly states, two lines of work that we can call critical perspective and constructive perspective. Constructive perspective does an important job of analysis and diagnosis with the different types of direct violence, structural and cultural, supplied by women. Constructive perspective analyzes and brings it visible the important contribution of women in peace building through work and care, and it looks and makes a proposal for alternative ways of being men and women under this light. This constructive perspective is less hegemonic with different reasons, with the different values of peace. And this could be the experience of women. And last, because not acknowledging the contributions of women, the history and contributions, it would be, as Carmen Magallón says, also to incur into a violence that is symbolic. And you can see that this is marked in the analysis of women for peace building. All violent men. There's important things in gender with the use of violence. We can see that in Spain, 94.8% of violence, direct violence against women are, there's of violence are by men. When we look at men and women before violence in literature, we have seen different reasons from more and less meaning can be summarized the following way. The first argument says about the biological differences between both genders, a perspective that has been questioned by the feminist that says women are not born, are made, and also questioned by the empirical evidence. We find women that want to be soldiers and men that contradict this topics about feminism. From this point of view, the other three arguments are more related with the different socialization of women. One argument states exclusion of women from the power and military culture as the main reason to understand their linkage with life. Throughout the history, women have been seen violence and armed forces. They have throughout their lives of how they learn in the mystic of violence from the popular culture, from the medical toys that we give children, movies. Another argument defended by the American feminist Claudia Hartz talks about subordination and dependence, economic and social, of women with respect to men as the cause of why women relate better and have developed a better capacity for empathy and peace. According to Claudia Carr, in an uneven relationship like gender and group, another type of relationship that is not even, the subordinated part needs to develop in order to transform peacefully conflict. All of these relationships to have the support in a way that the part that has the power does not need it. Unfortunately, there are women that really dedicate everything to transforming the conflicts. Last, the perspective that has the larger number of evidence and support through the different investigators mentions socialization of women in care as the main source of explanation of this movement of women in peace. The historical socialization of women would have developed in women peace skills that men could have also developed if their experience was similar. What we do is what makes us. And with the role of care for women, with this we can see the development of peace competences that we could share as human beings if all the duties to care for life were shared along with men. The practice should care develops the development of moral skills like empathy, patience, perseverance, responsibility, commitment, skills that are necessary for care and that are developed by this practice of care, what we do. Values that turn to be fundamental, the construction of all of this. The investigator for peace has already said it. A culture of peace is a culture that we can follow. As Carmen Magallón has said, Gilligan unveiled in 1982 the different moral voice that women develop through the practice of identity. In the analysis about the moral experience of women, detected a different moral voice that places as a preference the different relationships and the interpersonal links opposed with the ethics of justice in moral development according to Colvin, where you can see obedience as the main reason, the different voices Gilligan mentioned, and I think it's really interesting to insist, as has been mentioned by Dr. Magallón, this different moral voice is a result of the sexual division of work. Men and women develop two moral perspectives that are different based on that lack of uh, distribution of responsibility that is not fair. Socialization and the uneven practice contributes to develop three groups of skills for peace building. First of all, for the development and sustainment of life, and we can see that all of this are the vehicle in which we can see the care of basic needs, and they're fundamental for this important context that are for the safety of the human being. We are vulnerable, we can see with COVID, and we can see this clearly, and care gives us an answer to that inherent frailty of the human being. Second, it makes it easier in the ethics of care for the specific transformation of conflict. And the ethics of care provides us with different learning skills with conflict care with respect to using maybe punishment or the interest that everybody is satisfied. And I don't want to stop here. The contributions and on. Another contribution in peace building has to do with uh, building this and the ethics of care. All of this can be with us. It goes beyond of being private, and care becomes a source of social commitment and in citizens' practice. With this, care can contribute to revitalize citizenship or care of our citizens, not only from the rights point of view, but from the responsibility point of view, also from the responsibility contributing in creating citizens that participate. Joan Trumpton proposes a simple way to define citizenship as the process where citizens are committed and are involved in caring of human beings and nature. It's a way to define citizenship, the process in which individuals commit ourselves to care for each other and nature, while the ethics of justice, the concept of duty, is limited to the non-interference, no killing, not stealing. However, in the ethics of care, this includes the responsibility of responding to the needs of others from our own view, from the subject, not individualist, not as autonomous, but to link everyone as a human being that is connected, what is called an autonomy that is related. autonomy that is related. Under the light of these contributions of care to peace building, we don't have anything but to rescue the care of everything. We're talking about rescuing in many senses. First, because this is a value that is not being used so much. Modernity, work have taken us to a crisis of care, and we're talking about rescuing because not everything is positive, not everything is valid in caring. We need to avoid problems. We do not reivindicate care as self-sacrifice. We want care with the criteria of justice, as what we have seen. There's no care without justice, of course. As we have seen by Professor Marinis Esteban in her critical work of thought, she announced about the use of family to be submitted to family service and mandatory, and the importance of demanding this type of care. So the objective would be remove gender from care and make it generalized as a value. We can do it from different areas, from public policies, from the media, and it's very important. We have to include in our resume or in our education curriculum the lack of importance when we're looking and we mutilate the body of social knowledge that are part of the cultural the heritage and that are necessary. We need to include in the program care as a value that if it has been strictly left for women in order to keep all of this, however, this should and can turn into a human value where everybody is involved. Through education, we can walk to a mode of being cared for. This is not going to be an endless job. Because on one hand, the education system is affected by the way of being at work and it participates in becoming formal. And on the other hand, because a co-ed school has not allowed to overcome sexism, patriarchy continues to be reproduced in the school classroom. In a co-ed school, boys and girls have gathered, but they have not stated the need of having um, also co-ed teachers to learn together the best out of each. In place, we have institutionalized, like this was the male knowledge as the only knowledge of value. With this, we have really detain the equality to access of men and women to areas that are completely male and the other way around, same. We have been trying to make sure that women can develop their necessary skills so they can move around in the public and private areas, but not the other way around. Uh, the model is androcentric, that excludes anything that can be considered as feminine. In front of this, the co-ed school, it's trying to take a step further, trying to get rid of the hierarchy of gender, including in their program everything that is assigned to women as in care. Also, to include care in the school program can help us to overcome the deficiencies of pedagogy, all still hegemonic in the current time. A model that will be passive and would be apathic currently, and they participate in the reproduction of the way of being at work in front of this uh, uh, pedagogy that is by fair. We are talking about critical thinking. The pedagogy of care is going to go a step further because, as Nongin says, the pedagogy of care, it's something that it takes us to reduce suffering, sustainability of life, well-being of human being and nature would be the engines that promote the pedagogy of care. We have seen Neil Nugent that is trying to look for the schools where there's a reorganization to make sure that care is included, care for yourself, care for community, to care for foreigners, care for humankind, and to care for nature. It's important to teach how to acknowledge the vulnerability in the planet and to acknowledge the responsibility that everybody has. Care as a public asset is a responsibility that should be included in with men and women. The hegemonic educational curriculum has not included values as this that traditionally is associated to the experience of women. And if these skills are learned at school, they're going to be learned informally based on expectations that are filled with the stereotypes. The objective is to strengthen the capacity of care, to develop an honest concern for those that are suffering, and to acknowledge our competences as agents of change in a three-party type of situation, trying to look at caring for nature. In this sense, Trian Eshnen considers that their basic objective of education is to teach people to learn the skills for life. Eisler advocates for what thinks is education in front of an education for uh, everything, fraternity, solidarity. That's the challenge, the skills of caring for oneself and others in the environment. In order to look at this, we can summarize saying that in this new type of teaching committed with the recovery, we can say that we would not teach the arts of dominating everybody else, but to look at teaching human relationships. Fortunately, we can go to multiple methods so we can look at care. Formal educations, where we can see the experience of a real, it's fundamental, or narrative methods in literature. There's so many work, so many experiences, and we have to acknowledge looking and being at the center of education. Unfortunately, pedagogy, banking pedagogy, that it's geared to this, that continues to be hegemonic in informal education system, we can see to contribute and generate education that is transforming and to recover the way that we have to be cared for. As we follow Eichler and Noddings, we consider care as the main objective of education in a way that the education program should be geared to training people that are caring for everybody. We have to educate people that are aware of vulnerability that depends on humankind and nature. We need an education model that would look at respect for cultural diversity, including caring. In this program, it could be the first step to build that future that we want. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Irene Comins. La verdad
Thank
es
you,
muy
Irene.
apasionante el tema que planteas.
It's
A partir
passionate,
del
the topic
reconocimiento
that
de
you
las
mentioned,
habilidades
from the acknowledgement of skills
que promueve
and the
el cuidado,
values
habilidades y valores que
of
propician,
care.
y eso se ha destacado, o sea, la generación
This
de
has
paz,
been underscored.
una convivencia
Peace
pacífica
creation,
entre
a
las
peaceful
personas y de los seres humanos y la
life
naturaleza.
between people and
Eso es
human
un
beings,
avance educativo
nature.
distinto
With this, we
al
can
que
see
venimos
a
viendo
different
en la
education model, and I
Latinoamérica,
would
donde
say
se ha procurado
revolutionary, where
incluir estos valores
we
los
can see these values
currículum
included
del
in the
modelo, ¿no?
program and the
Entonces,
same model.
logrando salvar estas barreras que
Achieving,
nos han venido
overcoming these obstacles
que han sido un lastre durante siglos
that have
de
been
esta
dragging us for centuries in differentiation,
la
in different
se ha
roles in
asignado el
society,
cuidado,
where care
digamos, nada más a las
was
mujeres,
allocated for
y se ha
women.
propuesto
And
este
here the
reconocimiento
proposal is that
precisamente
we
a
approach the
partir de
topic of
reconocer
care
una cualidad
from acknowledging this as a quality
me quedo
that
con esa
should be for
definición
every
de
human being.
la
I keep that
ser
definitions of citizenship, that like the
responsabilidad del
process of
cuidado
getting
con los
involved
derechos
of
y
in
con la
the
salud
actions
humana
to
y
care
cuidado de
for
la
others
naturaleza. Yo
and care
creo que
for
podríamos
nature. I
perfectamente,
believe
como dices
that
ahora,
we
pasar
would
hacia la
move
paz
so
si
much
lo
for peace
planteáramos en
towards
esos
peace building
términos.
if we walked in these
Paso, por
terms.
último,
Last,
para terminar de completar
so we can
esta maravillosa
close this
mesa
wonderful
donde estoy más del
panel.
cuidado, paso a dar la palabra a la doctora
I give the
Mercedes
floor
Alcañiz Moscardó,
Dr.
quien es profesora
Mercedes
titular de
Acañiz,
Sociología de la Facultad de
Professor
Ciencias
of
Políticas de la
Sociology of the
Universidad
School
Llameí Castellón,
the University Yamey Primero in Castellón.
y presidenta del Comité de Sociología del Género de la
She's
Federación Española de
president of
Sociología.
the
Y nos trae
Spanish
una
Society of
plática de la
Sociology.
conciliación de la vida
She
familiar y
talks to
laboral
us
con el
about
cuidado
family
y no
life
violencia.
and the
Mercedes,
culture of
bienvenida
peace and
a esta gran
nonviolence.
casa.
Mercedes, welcome.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días y buenas tardes a todas y a todos. En primer lugar, quiero
Good
agradecer a la Universidad
afternoon.
Iberoamericana
I
y en
want to
especial
thank
a Elia
Iberoamerican
González
University,
Morales
Elia
por la
Gonzalez,
participar
for the
y
invitation to
compartir este tiempo
participate,
con
for
todos
sharing
ustedes.
this time
También
with
quiero
all of you.
agradecer a
I
Elena, a
want
la
to
doctora
thank
Elena, la
Elena
presentación que ha hecho y
for the
felicitar también a
presentation
mis
she's made,
compañeras
and I want to
Carmen,
congratulate
Irene,
my colleagues
Mercedes y
Carmen and
Carolina
Irene
que hemos
for their
compartido
wonderful
algunas
presentations
cosas.
that
Ya
they have
me
said a
conocen
few
un poco,
things.
pero bueno,
I don't have
simplemente
much to
añadir
add,
respecto
but
a
I probably would be able
Bien,
to
voy a
contribute.
compartir la
I'm going to
pantalla de nuevo.
share my screen with you.
No lo sé si voy a... Pues no, no. Se me ha ido. Bueno, a ver, ahora dónde estoy.
Mercedes, ahora busca el documento, porque sí habías logrado compartirla, pero
Sí,
estaba saliendo
sí,
digamos,
porque no tenía... porque lo tengo... Ah, ya, perdón, perdón. Vaya, lo tenía todo preparado y ahora
Okay, just one moment. I had everything ready. Just one moment.
es que no se me añade como antes, ¿eh? ¿Ahora lo ven?
no.
Bueno, pues nada, da igual, no pasa nada. Bien, bueno, siguiendo el hilo, pues hablo y ya está, porque por no perder tiempo. Siguiendo el hilo de lo que han
As we
platicado.
continue with what has been discussed by my colleagues before me, I believe that care is necessary to keep
Los
life.
cuidados hacen referencia pues, a la alimentación, a
To
la
take care of others
a
refer
la
to
alimentación,
food,
a la
clothing,
parte emocional.
housing, the
Y
emotional
esto ha sido
part.
básico a lo largo de la
This has
historia
been
humana.
basic
Y es
throughout
importante.
human
Lo que
history.
pasa es
It's
que también
important
están relacionados
because
con el
it's
momento
also
histórico,
related with
porque
the
los
historical
cuidados y las
moment.
necesidades de cuidado
if care with the needs of care are not the same throughout history, I think you can understand that the needs that we have, the social structure is very different to what we had in prior ages, and I'm going to be referring to this because of the uh, how big this topic is. This is evidence of how everything is in the current societies, where we can see this we need care, but we need a job as well. And this brings our society and turns our society into something different than the prior ones. And I'm talking about the prior ones from centuries ago. Then how do we reconcile this? The need for care and the need for work, that we know how important it is currently with caring to family and ourselves, and how the second part of my presentation, how this reconciliation or co-responsibility that I believe that it's better than the standards are more important and more than conciliation, is going to contribute to for society to acquire a bigger culture of peace and non-violence. I don't know if it's clear, if what I had said in the PowerPoint and that I don't know, I don't want to waste any time. To start, how do we get organized in society, in the current societies? Let's go back to 2 centuries ago. I think it's important to go back to that time where we see important social changes, the one that is political, that falls in the old regimen, and we start with a new political stage where citizens, and I say citizens with all the words, they have the right to participate in. Second, in the middle of the 19th century, we start an entire industrialization process. I believe that the first stage establishes, and I would explain this more in detail, it establishes a model of gender roles, patriarchal gender role, that was legally in consensus, and this was in the code of 1804 that is from France, but it turned to the rest of the European countries that brought it in their constitutions or civil codes, and also in the American countries after the independence and becoming in sovereign states. So this is a civil code that set the change of regimen, private property, a lot of political things that benefited men, but not women, and that work the same way. And here I can say, I'm reading, the husband has to protect the wife. The husband is the manager of the goods, and the wife cannot manage, and we couldn't even open, and they couldn't even open a bank account in according to Max Weber. I see this first time when the roles are completely separated, and this about incorporating the remunerated labor market, where we all know how this was, and women are at home to care for the members of the family. And this was also validated legally because it establishes the division of the roles on paper, just to say the least. And little by little, the different social agents, the companies, the union, the workers' unions, all of this comes together for all these models to be there. We see that the schools in the 19th century started to study, and the contents were different for boys and girls. And here you could see that there was the development of the roles that were so different. And I would like to say, because this is the 200th anniversary of Concepción Arenal, that was a feminist and sociologist, even if she didn't have a degree in that. And she has a wonderful work in the future of women, and another one that I really like. Uh, um, they quote something where they revindicate the work of women and says the following that I believe is extremely important, and it relates with what we have in my presentation. The industry should not say worker or mother, it should say mother and worker. We have to remember that we were in the 19th century. She was born in 1820, and she already had the vision that women were educated just to be caring for the children, for the husband, the parents, and she considered there was time for everything, and that women should also be part of the labor market. And here, of course, coming to consensus, the situation of lack of equality and discrimination for women and starting the feminist movements. Let's go to the second stage. Very quickly, because we don't have time for more, this is a very interesting period, and I believe that now we have to wait until the second, after the second World War II, where we see other activities that are so important for this system in gender. First of all, I would say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, obviously equality of genders, religions, and so on and so forth. But before that, before the statement of the 48, I think the Charter of San Francisco is very important because it also includes equality between men and women wanting to achieve peace, to preserve generations to come from the damage of war. We just left World War II, and we're searching for peace, including all of this equality between men and women, we know. And there's another important quote that is related to what's going to happen. And this is the Charter of San Francisco. In its beginning, it also includes that it makes a commitment by the UN. It commits for social progress and to increase the level of life. This charter considers that in order to avoid future wars that they're not as devastating, what has to improve is the level of life. And all the societies have to really work, and everything starts moving, and the development of the United Nations, and it's important that the effect of all of this, it promoted incorporation of women to the labor market, which is a change with respect to the prior situation. And back then, they could be part of the labor market. Men were not part of that in care, of course, that were being developed by women, with which we can see a phenomenon that many feminists, as Frida, Hochschild, Durand, Balbo, Lagarde have denominated as a double presence, double journey, double workday, the endless workday. This is the ideal situation, as Max Weber, to say that it produces change in society that is important, motivated by the proclamation of the principle of equality at the level of theory, and second, because of the economic development, the industrialization that in Spain took place in the 60s, and that motivated a change in the regime, the dictatorship by Franco. If you have the opportunity to look at the laws that were proclaimed back then, because this has a contradiction between the model of women that they wanted from the era of Franco, very traditional, very much at home, and so on and so forth, and the need of labor in the labor market. There's a colleague from Alicante University, Maria Jose Franco, that was saying that there was a phenomenon of daughters that were working to mothers that were working, because at the beginning only young women were working, because at the regimen it was considered that the most important role of women was to be wife, mother, and so on and so forth. What they were doing is when young women were working and they got married, they would get a severance paid, and the husband would get a monthly payment because they had somebody that depended financially on them at home. And the laws had to change because it didn't make sense that for each job they had to get a letter signed by the husband that she had permission to work. It was just for work. Why do I underscore all of this the second time? Because there's a change in the system of roles. There's a role, there's a gender with two roles. And this is not in the political arena, and it's not part of the parliament, and this is not for political the debate. And the women were supposed to take care of work at home, right? And there was a lot of discrimination. Why? Well, because we knew that it was considered the second income at home. Women had less education back then, so their income was lower, with less possibility to move forward, and they could retire, as we can see currently, where the people with less money, they're women that were older because they made less money. So this is one of the consequences, one of the current consequences. So the second time that I have called a phase, we get to the third phase, and I'm summarizing a lot, as you can say, but at the third phase, we can see other changes. We can see other important changes, and it's that they reconsider care as part of the feminist movement in Europe. Specifically, they set pressure, feminists from the lobbying in Europe of women that we currently have, and proposing measures, proposing standards to facilitate that work. I'll see the effects of this conciliation because it's interesting, but at least we can see a series of measures that can make it flexible for the presence in the labor market of women with children. I believe that in Spain, the first law related to this topic, it was Law 39 in 1999 of conciliation of labor life and family life of workers. There was criticism, and I'm going to concentrate in the content of what I have. What I think it's really interesting is that the law considers men as subjects of care. And this was not existent before. What they have done is before it's men that use conciliation measure. And we will see the opportunity because what the men were seeing is this law allows to see that these measures of conciliation that goes from the flexibility in the hours to cut down the hours of work and care, they can use they can be used by men and women. So this is in 1999. You can see how many years have gone by and what the data shows, the statistics of the Institute for Women are showing that there's a very low percentage, not even 10% in some of them, where these measures are being used by men. They're very low. So the machista culture is there, the men that works, the culture of being there, and women are the ones that take care. There's a lot of problems from the companies, so this is what happens. In other aspects, interiorization, as Dr. Irene has mentioned, of a series of values that are related with gender equality, and so on. And there's so many things. Law 3, inequality among women. There's a chapter dedicated to reconciliation, and they have developed later on. And it's going to be on October 14th, there was a royal decree about the plans for equality in the companies, um, about implementing equality plans. This is something very important. This is moving and it's obligating. It's mandatory. It's persisting, persists these stereotypes, the behaviors. This is more related with the traditional ones. And what do I mean with the revalorization of all of this? Well, maybe there's evidence by the feminist economists like María Ángeles Durán, Cristina Carrasco, Metzila Rañaga, and some others in Mexico. We probably have them about bringing evidence, about making it visible, the satellite accounts of the economy of care. This is very important, and all the hours that are dedicated to care, if they could be accounted for in the PNB. And I think there's a note that explains this clearly. Paul Samuelson, that is an economist, Nobel Prize, and so on, was explaining why the GDP goes down in a country, because if somebody marries, maybe the maid, well, when there's the maid, they're paying. If he marries, they're not going to be paying. That doesn't count in the national accounts. How? In the satellite account, you can see an evidence of the hours that are dedicated for women at home. And if this would count, the GDP would increase a lot more. And this is important to see this. And something also very important, that is to take away the gender in the care that is coming. That's fundamental, because care has a gender. Care is for everyone, to go to work and to earn the money. It's also something important, because nowadays we need it. So it's the same, and it's the same. And the proposal here would be that both would work on caring inside and out. For the salary that at other times they would go uh, uh, out and they would manufacture a piece of furniture, they would sell it, but yes, it was for the family. So I believe that this is very important. And what does this have to do with the culture of peace? I think reconciliation or conciliation means that the dictionary says to make it compatible, things that are not. That's the word conciliation, that has to do conciliating. There were a lot of reconciling places to reconcile different visions of the church. I believe that this is important. So here, I don't know, it's basic. This conciliation, to conciliate both parts, to take into account from the program of culture of peace in 1995, when they were talking about the need of a social change that included a new type of social contract between men and women, because the new contract, if it's more equalitarian, would contribute to a better culture of peace. This is clear in the idea of the culture of peace. In the lack of equality mentioned in structural violence that is necessary. Equality between men and women. And we can see the program of Culture of Peace in 1995 and the declaration of the program of actions on a culture of peace that the following year, the year 2000, it should be taken into account. And I believe this is very, very, very important. And then we could see the topic in the fourth conference of Beijing of 1995. And I think there was another interesting thing. Associations, states, they said what was being done wrong because, you know, for 20 years after the first conference took place in Mexico, and the data was showing that there was nothing that was very visible. So very few women in politics, the market was coming in worse conditions. You know, what was going on? The conclusion was clear in what we're analyzing today. There cannot be equality between men and women while women are the only ones responsible for the care inside the house. I don't want to go outside the house because this is part of our lives, but yes, inside the house. So as long as we could see this, there was not going to be you know, a definite equality, and that's the way that I'm going to see it in the plan of world action that was published after the celebration, looking into the need of bringing men into these tasks. A part of society cannot change if the other one doesn't change into a system of gender. From here, we can see that besides this contributions in standard and politics and reconciliation, we can see that we need to talk about the culture of gender. It's important to make changes in the culture of gender, change stereotypes, hierarchies, because we might believe that if a man is going to talk, you know, maybe that a woman talks. There has been a lot of giants. So this is a change in gender culture, which is basic. Another important thing by Dr. Cummins, this goes hand in hand, because I believe feminism is a movement of peace, because if we're looking for equality, we can see it of removing discrimination of all kinds. Otherwise, we could be talking a lot. I don't want to go any further. I'm sorry, because there's a couple of things that I had missing in PowerPoint, but after the theoretical introduction between reconciliation and the culture of peace, we could could see that reconciliation or co-responsibility that I like the most, of being co-responsible in both areas. It takes us to a new area of gender that helps us in a culture of peace that would end with patriarchy because it's direct violence, because we know all of what we have against women, structural and symbolical and cultural. So we see that the change would take us to equality, but also to a culture of peace where we can see other types of violence, but at least in this aspect, and to replace it with a system of equalitarian gender where they share care. I include here the ones from inside the house as well as the employment, which is necessary because it's necessary to go out and work and to pay for school, for food, for your children. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for having me here, and thanks the university for the initiative. Thank you, Mercedes. Thanks for being here. We thank you. The truth is that we really completed the different topics. If Dr. Irene Cromins was saying that when at schools became co-ed, the roles associated to women disappeared. Now we can say that Dr. Mercedes Alcañiz really closes this topic by incorporating women to the work life that brought as a result that men kept one single role and women have to develop two roles under these conditions that were worse and with this double shift and the need of not being having equality in everything that is responsible with the tasks and the duties at home. There are changes, acknowledgement, at least in paper, of men as subjects of care. They need to reassess care and to remove gender of care, which I believe is fundamental in order to create or to develop this culture of peace. With this, we close the three presentations. We have some time for questions. And of course, I would like to say hello to everybody that is with us in YouTube. Gina Arias Rodriguez is really sending her regards from Colombia. Please send us your questions, and we have some in the chat. There are different questions. I'm going to be reading three, and I open the mic, and so you can start answering. Adriana Martinez Noriega says, I want to thank this fora and the three speakers. In this theoretical framework, we see Eurocentric US bias. My question is, how do we set the solutions from our own context with respect to peace, the construction of peace? Carmen Diaz says that thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting and pertinent for the current context. For Irene, if you could share some example about how at the schools we have seen what they were saying about the pedagogy of care. The area where I work in human training, there's a lot of coincidences with the proposal, but part of the students see it as just additional topics, and sometimes it goes against to what's taught in other areas of the university. Rosario Roman, and whoever wants to answer, what is the story in European countries that have been able to go further, the male prejudice to be part of care? There's some more, and if it's okay with you, we will start with this, and then we will see if we can continue with the rest. Who wants to start? Carmen. Hi, thank you so much for your questions. They're all very interesting. Just a brief comment of this Eurocentric American focus. Yes, it's true, because yes, we talk from our own reality. There's no access to anything else. We have talked about critical attitude. Uh, we will see the critical analysis, and we will see the intersectional focus and the class, the ethnical belonging, culture, and of course, I cannot talk about how to perform this focus of care in societies where I do not leave it. Maybe I can read it in the books, but there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of things that are going to be questions in our own reality, why the care of the elderly and uh, it's in the hands of foreigners, for example. What has happened in societies is that there are less children being born because women, we have said, well, if society does not have the structures for care, then we're not going to have children. And that has happened in many countries. And I leave it here because that's all that I have for now.
Gracias, Carmen. Irene o Mercedes.
Thank you, Carmen, Irene, or Mercedes. How can we implement this? Well, this is complex, like culture. We need to do it from different areas, like care and education. This working at the level of elementary education in Spain. We can see the corners. It's in child, in very basic, to have small corners where you have maybe a library or a workshop, and maybe in a couple of months it's going to be a farm. And they say that throughout the class, those spaces should be natural spaces that are shared in equality by boys and girls. When you go into the space, boys and girls already have the gender stereotypes, and the girl goes to the kitchen and the boy goes to the car shop. And we can see this when we do this differently. It's so natural. Sometimes they're so young and they get to the place, and then they tell the dad, why are you at the sofa, dad, and mommy is always in the kitchen. So they realize sometimes that there are uncomfortable visits from the parents. So this is a very small experience, but sometimes I think it's so important. Changes in the labor system. The presentation, Dr. Mercedes Alcañiz, I think it's important to go to a shorter workday. We need to have a shorter workday because not only can we continue growing and producing endless and in a planet like ours, and we have to walk through this concept of co-responsibility, because even conciliation, I believe, is triple. It's not only family work conciliation, it's also civil, because if we only going to reconcile this, then when are we going to do everything else? We need to care, we need to have time to care for us, for our families, and also to care for others, to care for nature. So therefore, we're going to have to cut down our workday to share the work that is available among everyone and to make sure that we facilitate everything else, work, family, civilian. There's so many things that we can work on. And then the proposals, the new masculinity that is extremely interesting, how men, they're reivindicating. We need to share care not only for justice and equality, it's reivindicated, but also for reasons of happiness, of self-realization, because how this can be affected, emotions, paternity, happiness, self-realization, autonomy, because we have turned men that depend on others. And as Dr. Mercedes mentioned, this takes us to violence, the fact that at the end of the day, men have used violence as an instrument to make sure that they keep their place. If we make that men do not depend of care, that they're more independent, more autonomous, we're going to avoid this too. So also the new masculinity, fortunately, we have so many things that we can work with, positive, negative, but there are so many things that we
Gracias,
have.
Irene. Mercedes,
Thank you, Irene.
adelante, por
Creo
favor.
que sí, la última pregunta que creo
The
que
last
has
question
comentado
that
sobre cómo
you
estaba
mentioned
en otros países de
about
Europa.
how it was in other countries in
No
Europe.
sé si datos de memoria, pero
I don't have all
sí
of
que
this
hay mucha
information
diferencia
by
entre
heart, but
España
there's a
y
huge
Francia.
difference
Y a grosso
between
modo,
Spain and then a
sin
grosso
saber,
modo,
porque cada país
without
en la
knowing,
Unión
because each
Europea
country in
ha
Europe,
propuesto
they
muchas
give the
políticas,
standard
incluido
and
el presupuesto,
the budget,
para poner el
and
tema de conciliación
this is
y la
fixing
corresponsabilidad.
reconciliation and
Hace
co-responsibility. For
2 años en
example, up
España
to
la
3 years
tasa de
ago
conflictos era
in
15,
Spain,
15 días.
and they were,
5
if
días,
a
¿vale?
child
Lo
was
cual es un
born, they would
montón.
get 15 days,
Hace
the
ya
father.
3 años
2 or 3 years ago,
se aumentó a un mes. Y el
they
año pasado fue a un mes.
it was increased to
Pero ahora
1 month.
seguimos
Last year,
en
two
la
months,
misma
and
base
now they
maternal y
want the
paternal.
same
No hay
maternity leave and
Porque al
paternity leave. So
final,
there's no
como se ha
difference,
referido
because
anteriormente,
one
son
of the things that we have not
decisiones
mentioned is
normativas
that
que
the
si las siguen
adverse
utilizando,
effects of
pues
this,
no cambian
because
la
if
situación.
women
Con lo cual,
continue to use
ya
them, we
se
don't
tiene que
change
poner
things. So at the
obligatorio
end of the day,
de
it has
las
to be
razones de la
mandatory that
maternidad
men
6
should
meses,
have
lo que pasa
paternity
en
leave
otros
for
países
6 months,
europeos,
which is what happens in
en
other
algunos
countries in
países
Europe.
europeos. ¿Qué pasa? Que para eso se necesita una partida en el PIB anual dedicada a ese tema.
And
Y
for
como no
this,
la
they need to
consideramos,
have a
pues no
budget
se
for
ha
this,
dado.
because if we
Claro,
continue
las
like this, that
multinacionales
the
grandes, bueno, pues no
government
les
is going to
aplica.
be giving
Ese
the
es un
money to the
tema
companies to pay for
específico
that, well, then it's going to be a mess. So this is
para un
about the
presupuesto.
budget,
No hay un
which
efecto
is
perverso. El otro,
similar, so we don't have an adverse effect. Something else
de la
that
reducción semanal de
Irene has
jornada en
proposed
muchos
is to cut
países.
down
¿Por qué?
the workday. In
Porque si
Spain,
acaban
it's
a
very
las
important
8,
because some
o
companies
si es un alto jefe, acaba a las
finish their
9,
day
y
at
entonces
8, or maybe if they, in somebody at a high level, they
entonces,
close
ese cambio
at
de horario facilitará también
9.
la
So
conciliación
this would
entre
help the
la
conciliation
familia
between
personal y
the
pública,
work
porque si
life,
no,
personal,
doble jornada que
civil.
decimos,
So
¿vale?
otherwise it's going to be a
Porque,
triple work
claro,
day, because
entonces ya
after
empieza la
working and
conciliación
then you have
social,
to go
y eso
home
es
and you have to
imposible
take
con solo
care of
2 días.
everyone, and
Entonces,
then
no das para tanto. Entonces,
it's
la
not going to be enough.
reorganización
So
de días, pues es
reorganization
otro
of
de los
time,
aspectos que
which
creo
is
que
another
influyen
aspect
mucho
that I believe
y
that we have to care for,
pueden producir
can
efectos
have
en
an
esa
effect
conciliación. Y ya
in
no
this
digo nada más
conciliation. And
que
last
sí,
is,
para la conciliación se necesita
for
aprobar un
conciliation, we need to
decreto ley
approve
o
a
decreto
standard or a
cualquier
rule or a
decreto.
law
Pero
in
para la
any country.
corresponsabilidad se
But
tiene que
for
cambiar la cultura de género.
co-responsibility,
Se
we
tiene
need
que
to
cambiar
change the
el chip,
culture of
¿no?
gender.
Y entonces
We need to
eso tiene que
change that.
empezar
And this
más a
has
tierna edad. No, cuanto
to
más
start
estudios
sooner.
ya los tenemos
When we're talking about
más que
university,
notan su vida. Entonces tiene que ser cambiar esa cultura de
we
género
need to change the
y
culture of
educación por la
gender,
paz, que para mí va todo
education
unido,
for peace,
desde
everything goes
pequeños.
together
Y tratamientos, y
from
sé que
an
creo
early
que en España,
age.
Irene o
And I
Mercedes
believe
ya han
in
tocado
Spain,
un
Irene
poco
or
el
Carmen would
tema de
say,
eso.
um,
España
uh,
está más adelantada, ¿no?
this is
Tiene
going
más
to
institutos
happen.
para
This
la
is
paz en
really,
institutos, creo, no lo sé,
there are
Mercedes
different
está más
schools,
enterada que yo.
and
¿Vale?
they
Y
probably
eso
know better than I do.
ayuda también a
And
ese
this
tema.
helps in this topic.
Muchísimas gracias. Carmen, si me
Carmen,
permites, leo 3 preguntas y
I'm going to read 3 questions and then I give you the floor because so we can move because we're getting more and more questions. But I would be glad you start, you go back, and then we start talking about other things. Elvira Sandoval from YouTube is sending a question. In mental health, you mentioned the job or the maternal part in such a way that before mental health, what would be the role of the father? Gabriela Lopez Bernal says, thank you for the presentations. I really like them. My questions for everybody in Mexico, we have many municipalities with that change the logic of care for women. Public space is taken by a new stakeholder and changes the logical of the masculinity locally. What are the measures that have been taken in Spain to demilitarize? And do you know anything that takes over the use of public space for women? Thank you. Paris Cabello says, congratulations. Very well explained. My question is for Irene. How can socializing institutions, media can really go in teaching the ethics of care? I think something positive of the pandemic is that as parents, we have been sharing responsibility in care, and in the past, we were missing so many things. So once again, let's take these questions and we'll see how many questions we can answer. So Carmen, you're on now. We can't hear you. You have to open your microphone. I'm going to say things that my colleagues have mentioned, Irene. There's so many different fronts. There's so many different things that we need to introduce, that co-responsibility that we can see. I also share the responsibility better than conciliation. And I'm going to mention symbolic models. Just to say something that has not been mentioned, what symbolic models are being offered in boys and girls, which is things that we have seen, what symbolic models we have seen in the culture. Let's go over what are the, when we go to a park, to a public park, what are the historical figures that we can see? To look at the masculinity that has to be new, that causes so many misadjustments. How do we take, and mention that this is for their benefit? This makes me think what you were saying about some European countries. I have family, young men in London and Germany. One of my nephews, has been, has a newborn daughter, and to look about the shared maternity. And we have seen that even with this legislation for the first few years, this was only asked by women. So this has to be a legislation that is mandatory for men to take those months off. In Germany, legislation also is in favor of men staying at home the first months to help with care. Militarized municipalities of militarization, I can share with you that when the entire problem started, the politicians would go out from the government and they were talking about a war against the virus and that they were going to look at this, and there was criticism and militarized language And what was needed was more physicians and more militaries, and there has to be a democratic dimension of going in public debate and to talk through social media. And there was no question that the legislation, the public debate, the school, all of this is part of this, and the family also has to look into this. And as my colleagues used to say, yes, of course, what we do at home cannot be seen outside. We need to make it visible what men do, because what we do as women outside of the house can be seen. What men do inside cannot be seen. And we need to take this out in the light. Thank you, Carmen. Irene, I don't know if you want to answer, and I want to take this opportunity because we don't have a lot of time. Claudia Escobar says, what are the challenges and possibilities presented by the incorporation of the paradigm of taking care of higher education? These are experiences that have taken place in this sense. I give you the floor. Unfortunately, in general, we can see this, that has been implemented with very good results. And as we scale up with upper education, we disappear. There's less co-education. Some authors, like in Spain, Nuri, they propose the introduction of different concepts and local classes like chemistry. What better a chemical lab than the kitchen? The management of a class like chemistry, right? If we look at different activities, there's a good question and a key answer. I recommend the work that has been done, and the experience. They use care in interesting manners. Maybe a little bit, just to leave you some information, I encourage you to see a presentation where you can see a presentation that says that with respect to these laws that promote that the men can take ideas of reconciliation, she mentions that more and more companies, particularly in Europe, are stating that men that are parents and they are able to take off for paternity leave, and they don't take it, they take it negative. They believe that it's not a responsible person. So this is good. We have been growing, and I think we can continue to grow. In Brazil, we could see that to move with care in the way they do things. And I would say what I mentioned before, that we have to add this, not only work with labor, but the life as a citizen, and to win more spaces for care.
Muchísimas gracias, Irene. Mercedes, no sé si quieras cerrar con broche.
Thank you, Irene. I don't know if you want to close here. You know, this is wonderful, the way that we're closing. I just want to make an annotation and a reflection for what has been said by Gabriela, that has asked about in Mexico there's so many municipalities that are militarized, and that alters the logic a little bit. I was thinking, this is a 5-minute thought. This person that you know, I was not even thinking about this in Spain, but there's a problem in video games. I was told by my sister that my nephew, when he was young, he went into, I don't know, into the internet, and he found a video of Bin Laden killing. So I'm concerned about militarization, of course. This is a problem, of course, but for boys to learn these roles of violence and that they're associated in video games, you can see the pandemic, and one of the consequences that have been written about this is that the boys can see this, and they are really taking everything, and this is not enough. Video games are also important for them, and this is just a comment because this is something of great concern, violence in this type of situations. Thank you, Mercedes, Irene, and Carmen. There's no better discussion panel that doesn't leave questions unanswered, things for reflection, and specific proposals of where to walk. And I believe that this about the paradigm of care and peace construction has brought together these characteristics, and this is about different topics, and we can make specific changes that we can make in our society to work on a more peaceful working together. Thank you, Dr. Carmen, Dr. Irene, and Dr. Mercedes for being here. It has been a very enriching activity, and I'm sure that there's so many questions, and we will see you at some other times. Thank you for all your support, for all the logistics, for everyone that has been with us through Zoom and through YouTube. Thank you for being with us. And I would now give the floor to Dr. Elvia González de Pliego so she can make some announcements where we are. Thank you, Elena. Thanks, everyone. This panel has been wonderful. There's so many things in YouTube from Spain, from Colombia, from the state of Mexico. So many people that send their best regards. I want to thank you and to tell you that the next panel is going to be at 1 in YouTube, everything the same. Gender perspective before the challenges of peace in Colombia. The Pacific Route of Women and the University of Pereira in Colombia is going to be coordinating this. And then at 4, we have work in positive masculinity by the Center of Investigation for Peace, SIGMEX. So we will be around learning together, and everybody that is that you know, you can share with them because it's going to be in YouTube, moderators, speakers. Thank you. We'll see you later. Thank you. See you.